The stars had watched humanity grow for 6,000 years. And so had the Valkyrie Dominion. They were the oldest empire in the known galaxy, rulers of 300 worlds across the Orion Arm. And they had been watching Earth since before humans learned to write their own names. High Archon Zethral remembered the first reports about humanity, ancient documents that described small creatures building shelters from mud and animal skins, fighting each other with sticks and stones over patches of land that meant nothing in the grand scale of the universe. He had laughed at those reports back then, as had every member of the Dominion Council. They will destroy themselves within 1,000 years, the ancient scholars had predicted, like every other aggressive young species before them. But humanity did not destroy itself. Instead, something strange happened. Something that made the Valkyrie stop laughing and start paying closer attention. The humans kept surviving. They survived ice ages that froze their world for thousands of years. And they came out of those frozen times stronger and smarter than before. They survived plagues that killed half their population. And they learned medicine that would have taken other species 10,000 years to develop. They survived wars that burned their cities to ash. And they rebuilt those cities bigger and taller than ever before. And then, just 200 years ago by human counting, they left their world and reached for the stars. The Valkyrie Council had called an emergency meeting that day. The first emergency meeting in 800 years. This is too fast, Admiral Kethver had warned them, his scales turning pale with what could only be described as fear. They went from wooden boats to starships in less than 500 years. And that is not natural. But the Council had voted to wait and watch, as they always did. Because the Valkyrie had ruled for 6,000 years by being patient and careful. That patience had run out 3 days ago. High Archon Zethral stood now in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Assembly, surrounded by representatives from 40 different species, all of them looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The light of a dozen projected suns shone down upon his iridescent scales, making him look like a god among mortals, which was exactly the effect he wanted. "Fellow members of the Assembly," he began, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "I come before you today with news that will change the balance of power in our galaxy." The representatives leaned forward in their seats, their translators working overtime to convert his words into their native languages. The Valkyrie Dominion hereby declares formal war upon the species known as humanity, upon their homeworld called Earth, and upon all 47 of their colony worlds. Gasps filled the chamber, followed by whispers that sounded like a storm building on the horizon. No one had declared war in the Galactic Assembly for 3,000 years. Not since the Valkyrie themselves had crushed the last species, foolish enough to challenge their rule ambassador Yelani, sitting in the back of the Valkyrie delegation, felt her stomach turn with something she could not name. She had spent 50 years studying humanity as part of her diplomatic training, and she knew things about them that the High Archon did not seem to understand. She knew that humans did not think like other species, that they did not calculate risk and reward the way the Valkyrie did, that they had something inside them that made them fight, even when fighting made no logical sense. But she said nothing, because speaking against the High Archon in public would mean the end of her career and possibly her life. They spread across the stars like a virus. Zethral continued, his voice rising with practiced anger. They take world after world without asking permission from anyone. They build weapons that grow more powerful every year, and they breed faster than any species we have ever encountered. He paused for effect, letting his words sink into the minds of every representative in the chamber. If we do not stop them now, they will consume everything, and in another 1,000 years, there will be no Galactic Assembly. There will be no Valkyrie Dominion. There will only be humanity and the ashes of what came before. The vote was quick and decisive. Not because the other species agreed with the war, but because no one dared to stand against the Valkyrie. When they had already made up their minds, the declaration of war passed with only 7 votes against. And those 7 species would later find their trade agreements suddenly cancelled and their borders suddenly patrolled by Valkyrie warships 3 hours later. The message reached Earth President Elena. Vasquez was in the middle of a cabinet meeting when her aide rushed in with a datapad. His face white as snow and his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped the device twice before reaching her. She took the datapad from him with steady hands and read the message once, her face showing no emotion at all. The cabinet ministers watched her in silence, their hearts pounding as they tried to guess what news could make their usually unshakable aide look like he had seen a ghost. President Vasquez set down the datapad and looked around the room at the faces of the men and women who helped her lead humanity, the Valkyrie. Dominion has declared war on us, she said simply. They give us 30 days to surrender all our colony worlds and return to Earth, but we will remain under their supervision forever. The room erupted in chaos. Ministers shouting questions and demands, some calling for immediate surrender and others calling for defiance. But the president raised one hand and the room fell silent. She was 63 years old, a former astronaut who had walked on the moons of Jupiter, and a grandmother who still made cookies for her grandchildren every Sunday. But in that moment, she looked like something ancient and powerful, like the spirit of every human who had ever refused to kneel. We have survived ice ages, she said quietly. We have survived plagues that killed billions of our people. We have survived wars that burned our greatest cities to the ground. And we have survived every single thing that the universe has thrown at us for 200,000 years. She picked up the datapad again and looked at the declaration of war, then looked back at her cabinet with eyes that burned like stars. Tell them, she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made several ministers shiver. Tell them that we accept their declaration of war. Defense Secretary Marcus Cole cleared his throat nervously. Madam President, are you sure about this? Because the Valkyrie have 300 worlds and we have 47. They have been building warships for 6,000 years and we have been doing it for 200. The president smiled. And it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something that others did not. Secretary Cole, she said, do you know why we have survived everything that should have destroyed us? He shook his head, afraid to guess. Because we are stubborn, she answered. Because when the universe tells us to die, we say no. And when empires tell us to kneel, we stand up straighter. She turned to her communications officer. Send the response. And add one more thing at the end. What should I add, Madam President? Add this. We have been waiting for you. The message reached the Valkyrie High Command 6 hours later. And for the first time in 6,000 years, the rulers of 300 worlds did not know what to say. They had expected fear. They had expected desperate negotiations. They had expected humanity to beg for mercy the way every other species had begged before. Instead, they received 4 words that would haunt their dreams for years to come. We have been waiting. Ambassador Yelani read the human response and felt something strange stir in her chest. Something that might have been admiration or might have been terror. She could not tell which. What kind of species? She whispered to herself. Welcomes war against an empire that has never been defeated. She would learn the answer to that question soon enough, and it would change everything she thought she knew about the universe. The Valkyrie Armada dropped out of hyperspace above New Carthage on a Tuesday morning, blocking out the sun with their massive warships and casting shadows across the mining colony. Below, Admiral Kethver stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominance, watching the small blue and green world spin slowly beneath him. 200,000 humans lived on that world, digging precious metals from the mountains and sending them back to Earth. And soon those humans would learn what it meant to stand against the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. Begin the broadcast, he ordered his communications officer. And within seconds, his voice was echoing across every speaker on the planet below. People of New Carthage, he announced, his translator converting his words into perfect human speech. You are now subjects of the Valkyrie Dominion. And resistance is not only useless but illogical. He paused, expecting to see panic spreading across the human settlements, expecting emergency calls flooding into their communication networks, expecting the humans to do what every other species had done when faced with overwhelming force. Instead, he saw something that made his scales turn pale. The humans were not running. They were not hiding. They were not sending desperate messages begging for mercy. They were digging, all across the colony. Humans were pouring into the mine shafts they had spent years carving into the mountains, and they were taking everything with them. Their children, their elderly, their food supplies, and something else that the Admiral's sensors could not quite identify. What are they doing? He demanded, turning to his tactical officer with growing confusion. The tactical officer studied his screens for a long moment before responding. They appear to be fortifying the underground tunnels, Admiral. And they are moving heavy equipment into defensive positions. Admiral Kethfer laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the bridge. They think they can hide in holes like animals. Very well. We will dig them out. He ordered the first wave of landing craft to descend. 40,000 soldiers in gleaming armor, carrying weapons that could level mountains. And he expected the invasion to be over within hours. That was his first mistake. The landing craft touched down in the main valley, their doors opening to release soldiers who had trained for decades and fought in a dozen campaigns across the galaxy. They found the valley empty, the buildings abandoned, and the streets covered in a fine layer of dust that made it look like the colony had been deserted for years rather than hours. Sergeant Valtosh led his squad through the silent streets, his weapon raised and his senses alert for any sign of human movement. This is too easy, whispered one of his soldiers, a young recruit named Carmel, who had never seen combat before. There is no such thing as too easy, Valtosh replied. But even as he said the words, something in his stomach told him that the young recruit was right. They found the entrance to the mines 10 minutes later, a massive opening in the side of the mountain that led down into darkness. Send in the drones, ordered the captain who was commanding their battalion. And within seconds, a dozen flying machines zipped into the tunnel, their lights cutting through the black. The drones traveled for exactly 37 seconds before every single one of them went offline at the same moment. What happened? The captain demanded, before anyone could answer. The mountain exploded, not the whole mountain, just the entrance to the mine, collapsing in a thunderous roar that buried 600 Valkyrie soldiers under tons of rock and sealed the tunnel completely. The humans had been waiting for them all across New Carthage. The same scene played out again and again. Valkyrie soldiers advancing toward mine entrances, only to be caught in traps that the humans had prepared with frightening speed and precision. In Sector 7, a construction mech that had been used for digging ore suddenly came to life, its massive arms swinging through a squad of soldiers like they were made of paper. The human operating the mech was a woman named Rosa Martinez, age 52, mother of 3 and grandmother of 7. And she had never held a weapon in her life before that morning. She fought for 4 hours, using her mining machine to crush Volcara soldiers and destroy their vehicles, until finally a plasma blast tore through the cockpit and ended her life. But before she died, she sent a message back to Earth, a video that will be watched by billions of humans in the days to come. They came to our home, she said in the video, her face covered in blood and her eyes burning with defiance. They came to take our children and our freedom, and they thought we would just give up. She smiled. even as warning alarms screamed around her. They do not know us very well. In Sector 12, 94-year-old Maria Santa sat in a small control room deep beneath the surface, watching the Valkyrie forces advance on her position through security cameras. She had lived on New Carthage for 60 years, had raised 4 children, and buried 2 husbands. And she had no intention of spending her final days as a slave to some alien empire. Her finger hovered over a button connected to the fuel depot that powered the entire eastern grid. 15 million liters of hydrogen fuel that the Valkyrie landing craft were using as a refueling station. "Are you sure about this, grandmother?" asked her great-grandson, Tomas, who stood beside her with tears streaming down his face. "My darling boy," she said softly, "I have lived a long and wonderful life, and I will not let these creatures take that away from the children, who still have their lives ahead of them." She pressed the button, and the fuel depot erupted in a fireball that could be seen from orbit, taking 3 Valkyrie landing craft and 2,000 soldiers with it. Maria Santos died with a smile on her face, and her final words, broadcast live to Earth through her personal communicator, became the rallying cry of humanity. "Come and take it," she had said, and across 47 human worlds. Those words were printed on signs and painted on walls and whispered like a prayer. Admiral Keffer lost 40,000 soldiers taking New Carthage, 10 times more than his analysts had predicted. And when he finally stood in the ruins of the main settlement 3 weeks later, he found something that made his blood run cold. The humans had carved a message into the central plaza before retreating into the deeper tunnels. Letters 10 meters tall, cut into solid rock with mining lasers. This was the easy one. He ordered his soldiers to destroy the message. But the words had already been photographed and transmitted across the galaxy, and nothing could erase them from the minds of everyone who saw them. That night, the Valkyrie High Command gathered for an emergency meeting. The second emergency meeting in their history caused by humanity. "How is this possible?" demanded High Archon Zethral, his voice trembling with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "They are a primitive species with inferior technology and inferior numbers. How did they kill 40,000 of our soldiers? How did they kill 40,000 of our soldiers?" Admiral Keffer had spent the entire journey back to the Dominion homeworld studying human history, reading every file and watching every recording he could find. And now he understood something that filled him with a terror unlike anything he had ever known. "They do not calculate acceptable losses," he said quietly. "We fight wars by comparing the cost of victory to the value of the prize, and if the cost is too high, we negotiate or retreat." He looked around the room at the ancient leaders of an ancient empire. Humans do not think that way. They do not calculate what they can afford to lose. They calculate what they cannot afford to lose. And once they decide something is worth fighting for, they will burn everything, including themselves, to keep it. He pulled up images from the battle, showing elderly women piloting mining mechs into combat and teenage boys building bombs from industrial chemicals, and ordinary civilians charging Valkyrie soldiers with nothing but tools and fury. "We are not fighting an army," he concluded. "We are fighting a species that would rather die than kneel." The High Command sat in silence for a long moment, and for the first time in 6,000 years, the masters of 300 worlds did not know what to do next. Ambassador Yelani, who had been allowed to observe the meeting but not speak, looked at the images of human defiance and felt that strange feeling stir in her chest again. She was beginning to understand what it was. It was hope. Hope that perhaps the galaxy was not as fixed and unchanging as her people believed. Hope that perhaps there were still species out there who could surprise an ancient empire. Hope that perhaps the Valkyrie themselves could learn to be something more than they had been for 6,000 stagnant years. She said nothing, but she began to make plans of her own. Plans that would eventually change the course of the war and the future of both species. But that was still to come for now. The Valkyrie prepared for their next attack, and humanity prepared to show them that New Carthage had indeed been the easy one. The galaxy expected Earth to burn with panic when news of New Carthage spread across human space. They expected riots in the streets and governments collapsing under the weight of fear. They expected humanity to finally understand that they were facing an enemy they could not defeat. Instead, something happened that no species in the galactic community had ever seen before humanity went quiet. For 3 days after the fall of New Carthage, there were no broadcasts from Earth, no official statements from the United Earth government, no declarations of surrender or desperate pleas for help. The Valkyrie intelligence officers watched their screens with growing confusion, unable to understand what was happening in the human systems. Perhaps they are already fighting among themselves, suggested one analyst. Perhaps their alliance is breaking apart under the pressure. But Ambassador Yelani, who had been studying humanity for decades, knew better. They are not fighting, she said quietly. They are planning. She was right on the 4th day. President Vasquez appeared on every screen in human space, her face calm and her voice steady. And she spoke words that would echo through history. My fellow humans, she began. 4 days ago, we lost New Carthage to an enemy that has ruled the stars for 6,000 years. And I know that many of you are afraid. She paused, and when she continued, there was steel in her voice that had not been there before. But I also know what we found in the ruins of that colony. Messages from our brothers and sisters who fought until their last breath, who turned mining equipment into weapons and fuel depots into bombs, who looked at an army of hundreds of thousands and said no. She held up a photograph of Maria Santos, the 94-year-old grandmother who had given her life to destroy those landing craft. This woman killed 2,000 enemy soldiers before she died, and her last words were, "Come and take it." So I say to the Valkyrie Dominion, come and take it. Come and take our worlds if you can. Come and take our freedom if you dare. She leaned forward, her eyes burning into the camera. But know this, for every world you take, you will pay a price that will break your empire. And for every human you kill, 10 more will rise to take their place. Because we are not a species that surrenders. We are not a species that kneels. We are a species that survives. The broadcast ended. And across human space, the real transformation began. Factories that had spent decades making luxury goods and consumer electronics shut down overnight and reopened the next morning, producing weapons and ammunition. The Chun Automotive Corporation, which had been building cars for 150 years, announced that it would now be building tanks and armored personnel carriers. And their first combat vehicle rolled off the production line. Exactly 17 days later, universities across Earth converted their research programs to military applications. Physicists who had been studying theoretical problems began designing new shield generators. Biologists who had been researching disease began creating medicines that could heal combat wounds in minutes. And engineers who had been building bridges began designing starships. The squabbling nations of Earth, who had argued about trade deals and border disputes for decades, sent their representatives to Geneva and emerged 3 days later with the Treaty of Human Unity, the first document in history signed by every government on the planet. We did not know, said the Chinese ambassador after the signing, that it would take aliens trying to conquer us to finally make us stop fighting each other. But here we are, across the 46 remaining colony worlds. Similar transformations took place on Nova Rama, a farming colony that had never seen conflict. The colonists began training with weapons they built themselves from agricultural equipment on Kepler's Hope, a scientific research station The scientists stopped studying alien life forms and started studying how to kill them, and everywhere. The young men and women of humanity lined up at recruitment centers, waiting for hours to sign their names and join the fight against an empire that had expected them to surrender. Captain James Okonkwo watched the transformation from the bridge of his ship, the S Defiance, as it orbited Earth's moon and prepared for the first human counterattack. He was 47 years old. Born on the coast of what had once been called Nigeria before the borders were erased by the Unity Treaty. And he came from a family that had been fighting against impossible odds for generations. His great-grandfather had survived the Lagos flood of 2089, a disaster that had killed 3 million people in a single night. By swimming for 6 hours through toxic water with his infant grandmother strapped to his back, his grandfather had led one of the first colonial missions to Alpha Centauri, facing radiation storms and equipment failures that would have killed anyone who was not too stubborn to die. His mother had been a Marine biologist who spent her life fighting against the corporations that were poisoning Earth's oceans. And she had won. Now it was his turn to fight. And he was ready, Captain, said his executive officer, Commander Sarah Chun. The fleet is assembled and awaiting your orders. Okonkwo looked at the tactical display, showing the positions of 73 human warships gathered around the moon, facing a Valkyrie armada of over 200 vessels that had been sent to blockade Earth. Commander, he said, do you know what the Valkyrie analysts predicted before the war began? She shook her head. No, sir. They predicted that we would surrender within 30 days of the first attack, that our primitive ships would be destroyed within hours of any engagement, and that our species would spend the next 1,000 years as servants of their empire. He turned to face her, and there was a fierce joy in his eyes that made her heart pound with something that felt like pride and terror mixed together. I think we should explain to them why those predictions were wrong. The Battle of Proxima Reach began at exactly 1400 hours Earth time, when Captain Okonkwo's fleet engaged the Valkyrie blockade force in the outer reaches of the solar system. The Valkyrie admiral expected an easy victory. Her ships outnumbered the humans 3-1, and her technology was supposed to be centuries ahead of anything humanity could build. She was not prepared for what happened next. The human ships did not fight like any enemy the Valkyrie had faced before. They did not form neat battle lines and exchange fire at long range. They did not retreat when their shields failed or their weapons were damaged. Instead, they charged directly into the heart of the Valkyrie formation, accepting terrible damage to get close enough for their weapons to penetrate the alien shields. The S Defiance took 17 direct hits in the first hour of battle, losing half its crew and most of its weapon systems. But Captain Okonkwo refused to retreat. We are not here to survive, he told his remaining crew. We are here to teach them what it costs to threaten our home. His damaged ship rammed a Valkyrie cruiser, using its failing engines to push the alien vessel into the path of another cruiser. And the resulting collision destroyed all 3 ships, but Captain Okonkwo had already transferred to an escape pod, and he spent the rest of the battle coordinating the human fleet from a craft smaller than most Valkyrie storage containers. When the battle ended 11 hours later, the Valkyrie had lost 62 ships to humanity's 23. More importantly, the humans captured 40 intact Valkyrie vessels, either through boarding actions or by disabling their engines and forcing surrender. Within 6 months, human engineers had reverse-engineered the alien technology and begun producing improved versions that were better than the originals. How is this possible? Demanded Admiral Kethver when he received the reports. We have been developing this technology for thousands of years. How can they improve upon it in mere months? The answer came from an unlikely source, a Valkyrie scientist who had spent her career studying comparative evolution. They evolve faster than us, she explained simply. not biologically, but culturally and technologically. They do not wait for consensus or approval. They experiment and fail and try again until they succeed. And what takes us centuries takes them years. She pulled up graphs showing the rate of human technological advancement compared to every other species in the galaxy. And the difference was terrifying. In the 200 years since they achieved spaceflight, she continued, they have made more technological progress than we have made in the last 2,000 years. And the war is only accelerating their development. She looked at the Admiral with something that might have been admiration or might have been despair. We thought we could crush them before they became a threat. But we were wrong. The war is not weakening them. It is making them stronger. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the young species that everyone had expected to break began pushing back against the greatest empire the stars had ever known, and in the shadows, Ambassador Yelani began to wonder if perhaps the Valkyrie had not declared war on humanity to save themselves, but had instead awakened something that would change the galaxy forever. The neutral station called Haven's Rest floated in the space between empires, a place where enemies could meet without weapons and speak without war. Ambassador Yelani arrived first, her shuttle docking at the station's eastern port, while she wondered if she was making the greatest mistake of her long career. She had spent 3 months arranging this meeting in secret, using channels that no one in the Valkyrie High Command knew existed, risking everything she had worked for over 50 years of diplomatic service. If the High Archon discovered what she was doing, she would be executed for treason before the Teneum. Sun set on her homeworld, but she had watched the war unfold for 8 months now, had seen the casualty reports that grew longer with each passing week, had witnessed her ancient empire begin to crack under the pressure of fighting an enemy that refused to behave like any enemy should behave. Something had to change, or there would be nothing left to save the human diplomat. Arrived 30 minutes later. A man named Dr. Samuel Chun, who had been selected for this meeting because he spoke 7 languages including a passable version of Valkyrie, and because he was known throughout human space for his ability to find common ground where none seemed to exist. He was 61 years old, with gray hair and gentle eyes that seemed too kind for a species that had just destroyed a third of the Valkyrie fleet in a series of brutal engagements. They met in a small conference room with a window that looked out on the stars, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. It was Yelani who broke the silence. "Do you know why we declared war on your people?" she asked, her voice carrying a weight of exhaustion that surprised even her. Dr. Chen studied her face with those gentle eyes. "Your High Archon said that we were spreading like a virus across the galaxy, that you needed to stop us before we consumed everything. That is what he told the assembly." Yelani agreed. "But that is not the truth." She moved to the window and looked out at the distant stars. So many worlds that had been ruled by her people for so long. "The truth is that we declared war because we were afraid. And not afraid of what you would do to us, but afraid of what you showed us about ourselves." Dr. Chun said nothing, simply waited for her to continue. "The Valkyrie have ruled the Orion Arm for 6,000 years, she said softly. "We achieved what we believed was perfection. Our technology was the most advanced in the galaxy. Our society was stable and peaceful. Our art and culture were the envy of every species we encountered." She turned to face him, and he was surprised to see what looked like tears forming in her alien eyes. "But perfection is a lie, Dr. Chun. Because perfection means you have stopped growing, and a species that stops growing has already begun to die." She pulled a small device from her pocket and projected an image into the air between them, a graph showing Valkyrie technological advancement over time. "For the first 3,000 years of our empire, we were like you, constantly changing and improving, discovering new things and building new wonders. But then we decided we had learned enough, that there was nothing left to discover, and we stopped." The line on the graph went flat, stretching For thousands of years without any upward movement. For 2,000 years, we have made almost no progress in any field. Our scientists study the same problems our ancestors studied. Our artists create the same art our ancestors created. And our people live the same lives their great-great-grandparents lived. She looked at Dr. Chen with eyes that held something like despair. We are not an empire anymore. We are a museum. And when we looked at humanity and saw how fast you were growing, how much you were changing, how alive you were compared to us, we realized that we were already dead. Dr. Chen absorbed this information in silence, his mind racing through the implications of what she was telling him. So you declared war, he said slowly, not to destroy us, but to try to wake yourselves up. Yelani nodded. The High Command believed that a great war would force our people to innovate again, to remember what it felt like to fight for survival, to become the species we once were. She laughed bitterly. Instead, we discovered that we have forgotten how to adapt. Our soldiers still fight using tactics that were developed 3,000 years ago. Our engineers still think that our technology cannot be improved, and our leaders still believe that we can win by simply throwing more resources at the problem. And humanity? Dr. Chen asked. Humanity has adapted to every challenge we have thrown at you. Yelani answered. You have reverse-engineered technology that took us centuries to develop. You have created new weapons and new tactics that our analysts cannot predict. And you have unified your entire species in a way that we could never accomplish, even when we were at our strongest. She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The war is lost, Dr. Chen. Our High Command knows it even if they refuse to admit it. And within a year, perhaps two, your fleets will be in orbit around our home world. Dr. Chen looked at her with those ancient, gentle eyes, and she saw something there that she had not expected to find understanding. You came here to negotiate a surrender, he said. No, she replied. I came here to ask for something far more valuable than surrender. She took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine the fate of two species. I came here to ask you to save us. Dr. Chen said nothing, but his eyes asked a question that his lips did not speak. We do not need you to spare our lives, Yelani continued. We need you to teach us how to live again. We need you to show us what it means to grow and change, to fail and try again, to be alive instead of simply existing. She pulled up another projection, this one showing the Volcari homeworld. There are young people among my species who watch humanity with fascination instead of fear. Scientists who dream of discovery instead of preservation. Artists who want to create something new instead of copying the old. But they are silenced by our elders who believe that change is death. She looked at Dr. Chen with desperate hope. You could give them a voice. You could show them that change is not something to fear but something to embrace. You could help us become what we used to be. Dr. Chen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the same stars that had witnessed 6,000 years of Volcari rule. You know, he said quietly, when I was a child, my grandmother told me stories about the old wars on Earth, the ones we fought against each other before we finally learned to fight together. He turned to face her. She told me that the worst thing you could do to a defeated enemy was destroy them completely, because then you would never know what they might have become, what gifts they might have given to the universe if you had let them survive. He moved back to the table and sat down across from her. Humanity has spent 200,000 years learning how to survive, he said. We have survived ice ages and plagues, famines and floods, wars that killed hundreds of millions of our own people. And we survived because we refused to give up, no matter how bad things got. He reached across the table and took her hand in his. An intimate gesture that would have been unthinkable in formal diplomatic settings, but felt absolutely right in this moment. But surviving is not the same as living, he continued, and we have also spent those 200,000 years learning how to help others survive. how to lift them up instead of pushing them down, how to make room at the table instead of fighting over scraps. He smiled, and it was a warm smile that made Yelani feel something she had not felt in centuries, something that might have been hope. Go back to your people, he said. Tell them that humanity does not want to destroy the Valkyrie. Tell them that we want to show them what it means to be alive again. Tell them that there is room in this galaxy for both of our species, and for something new that neither of us can imagine yet. Yelani felt the tears finally fall from her eyes, running down her scales in silver streams. The High Archon will never accept this, she said. He would rather see our civilization burn than admit that we need help from a species he considers inferior. Dr. Chen nodded. Then we will have to convince him otherwise. He stood and walked to the door, then turned back to face her one final time. Ambassador, humanity has faced many enemies in our history, but our greatest victories have never come from destroying those enemies. They have come from turning them into friends. He opened the door. Tell your High Archon that humanity is offering him something more valuable than victory or defeat. We are offering him a future. Yelani watched him go, and for the first time since the war began, she believed that perhaps both species might survive to see what the galaxy could become when ancient empires and young dreamers learned to work together. But first, she had to convince her people that surrender was not the same as defeat, and that accepting help was not the same as admitting weakness. It would be the hardest task of her life. But she was Valkyrie, and her people had once known how to fight. For things that mattered, perhaps it was time to remember. The war ended not with fire and blood, but with an outstretched hand. President Elena Vasquez stood in the grand chamber of the Galactic Assembly, the same room where High Archon Zethrol had declared war on humanity just 14 months earlier. And she looked out at the representatives of 40 species who had gathered to witness something that none of them had ever expected to see. The Valkyrie delegation sat in their traditional place of honor at the front of the chamber. But they did not look like conquerors anymore. They looked like survivors who had finally understood that survival was not enough. High Archon Zethrol had aged visibly since the start of the war. His scales had lost their iridescent shine, and his eyes carried a weight that spoke of sleepless nights and terrible decisions. He had watched his fleets destroyed at Proxima Reach and New Helsinki, and a dozen other battles where human courage had overcome Valkyrie numbers. He had received reports of entire battalions surrendering rather than facing human soldiers who fought with a ferocity that made no logical sense. He had listened as his own advisors whispered that perhaps the war had been a mistake, that perhaps they had awakened something they could not control, and finally, he had received Ambassador Yelani's report about her secret meeting with Dr. Samuel Chun, a report that had shown him a path forward that he had never imagined. President Vasquez, he had said during their first official communication 3 weeks ago, I do not know how to say what I must say. She had watched him through the screen with eyes that showed neither anger nor triumph, only a calm patience that seemed to belong to someone much older than her 63 years. Then say it simply, she had replied. We have learned that simple words often carry the most truth, and so he had said it simply. We were wrong. 3 words that an empire of 6,000 years had never spoken before. 3 words that cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. 3 words that would change the future of the galaxy. Now he stood before the assembly, before humanity, before history itself, and he prepared to say those words again. This time, for all the universe to hear, representatives of the Galactic Assembly, he began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hearts. I stand before you today to announce the end of the war between the Valkyrie Dominion and the species known as humanity. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and he waited for them to settle before continuing. But I am not here to announce a simple ceasefire or a negotiated peace. I am here to announce something that has never happened in the 6,000 years of our empire's existence. He reached to his belt and drew his ceremonial blade. The same blade that had been carried by every High Archon since the founding of the Dominion. A symbol of power and authority that had never been surrendered to any enemy. Then he did something that made every Valkyrie in the chamber gasp with shock. He knelt before President Vasquez and laid the blade at her feet. On behalf of the Valkyrie Dominion, he said, his voice breaking with emotion, I offer our unconditional surrender and our eternal gratitude. President Vasquez looked down at the kneeling Archon, at the blade that represented 6,000 years of galactic dominance. And she did something that no one expected. She knelt beside him and picked up the blade, then placed it back in his hands. Stand up, she said gently. The Valkyrie do not need to kneel before humanity, and humanity does not want to be your conqueror. She helped him to his feet and turned to face the assembly, still holding his hand in hers. 14 months ago, the Valkyrie declared war on humanity because they feared what we represented. They saw our growth and our change and our constant evolution, and they believed that we would consume everything they had built. She looked at Zethral with something that might have been compassion, that they were wrong, just as we would have been wrong if we had used this war to destroy them forever. She released his hand and addressed the entire chamber. Humanity does not seek to rule the galaxy. We do not seek to replace one empire with another. We seek something far more valuable than dominance. She paused, letting her words sink into the minds of every representative in the room. We seek partners. We seek allies. We seek friends who will walk beside us into a future that none of us can imagine alone. She turned back to Zethral. And so, instead of accepting your surrender, I offer you something else entirely. She pulled a document from her pocket and held it up for the assembly to see. The Covenant of Shared Horizons. She announced a full military alliance between humanity and the Valkyrie Dominion. A complete exchange of all scientific and technological knowledge. And a joint colonization initiative that will take both our species to the farthest reaches of the universe. The chamber erupted in noise, some species cheering and others shouting objections. But President Vasquez continued speaking over the chaos. The Valkyrie have 6,000 years of knowledge that humanity has never seen. Secrets of stellar engineering and planetary construction that could benefit every species in this assembly. She smiled. And humanity has something that the Valkyrie have forgotten. We have the ability to change, to adapt, to grow. And we are willing to share that gift with anyone who is willing to accept it. She turned to face Zethral one final time. High Archon, humanity does not want to conquer you people. We want to teach them how to live again. We want to show them that change is not death. It is rebirth. For a long moment, Zethral said nothing. His eyes locked on the human woman who had somehow turned defeat into something that felt like victory. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the document from her hands. For 6,000 years, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. My people have believed that we were the masters of the galaxy, that we had nothing left to learn from anyone. He looked down at the Covenant, at the words that promised a future neither species could have imagined. Alone, we declared war on humanity because we saw our extinction in their eyes. We saw a species that would grow and change and eventually leave us behind, like forgotten ancestors. He looked up at President Vasquez, and there were tears in his ancient eyes. Instead, you offered us rebirth. Instead of destroying us, you offered to carry us with you into the future. He turned to face the assembly, holding the Covenant high for all to see. On behalf of the Valkyrie Dominion, I accept the Covenant of Shared Horizons. I accept the alliance that humanity has offered. And I accept the gift of change that we forgot how to give ourselves. The chamber fell silent as the weight of the moment settled over every representative in the room. Two species that had been locked in a war of annihilation just hours ago were now allies. Partners, friends, and the galaxy would never be the same. 50 years later, the first hybrid Valkyrie human colony ship launched from the joint shipyard that orbited the Valkyrie homeworld. Its hull gleaming with a combination of human innovation and Valkyrie engineering that neither species could have achieved alone. Admiral Okonkwo, now 97 years old but still sharp as ever, stood at the viewing platform with Ambassador Yelani, watching the ship begin its long journey toward the Andromeda Galaxy. "We never found out what happened to Captain Chun," he said, referring to the diplomat who had first offered Yelani a way out of the war. She smiled, her scales shimmering with the healthy glow that had returned to her people since the signing of the Covenant. "He retired to a small island on Earth," she said. "He spends his days fishing and writing poetry about the stars." Okonkwo laughed. "That sounds like something he would do." They watched in comfortable silence as the colony ship grew smaller and smaller, carrying thousands of humans and Valkyrie into the unknown on its hull, inscribed in both languages in letters that could be seen from orbit, were the words that humanity had chosen as their answer to a galaxy that had expected them to break. "Still here. Still rising. Room for more." Okonkwo read the words and felt something warm bloom in his chest. Something that might have been pride or might have been love or might have been both. "You know," he said softly, "when the war started, everyone expected us to fight until there was nothing left. They expected us to destroy your empire or be destroyed by it." Yelani nodded. "That is what we expected as well. But that was never who we were," Okonkwo continued. "Humans have always been fighters, but our greatest battles have never been about destruction. They have been about survival, about protecting the people we love, about building something that will last long after we are gone." He turned to face her, and in his ancient eyes she saw the same fierce determination that had carried humanity through 200,000 years of challenges. "We did not survive ice ages and plagues, and wars just to become the monsters we always feared," he said. "We survived so that we could lift others up, so that we could show the galaxy that there is always room for more at the table." He looked back at the ship that was now just a small point of light against the infinite darkness, and that is what it truly means to be human. Yelani watched the ship disappear into the stars and felt something she had not felt since before the war began. Something that her people had forgotten for 2,000 years. She felt alive, and she knew that this was just the beginning. That the Covenant of Shared Horizons would lead to discoveries and adventures that neither species could imagine. That the galaxy was about to